The steel doors of the retired K9 containment wing were closing when Rex snapped the second restraint. 95 pounds of black German Shepherd drove low across the concrete. Muzzle scarred. Eyes fixed on the combat harness swinging from a guard's hand. He did not bark. He moved with the cold silence of a dog who had learned war before he had learned trust. Taser lights climbed his chest. A veterinary syringe waited under white fluorescent glare. One wrong step, and the order to drop him would become permanent. Then Caleb Ward crossed the yellow line. He looked like nobody the base would fear or respect. Just a thin former medic in a faded field jacket. Mud on his boots. An old envelope crushed beneath one arm. Guards reached for him. But Caleb lowered himself to one knee and opened the rusted dog tag he had carried since Kandahar. The tiny hinge clicked. Rex stopped mid-lung. His growl broke off. His ears lifted. His nose trembled over burned brass. Old blood. And field antiseptic, the dog everyone called Broken, took one careful step closer. Then pressed his scarred muzzle into Caleb's shaking palm. As if remembering a name the file had buried. No one in that room understood why a condemned K9 had surrendered to a poor medic with a dead man's tag. And if that question is pulling you in, stay with this story and subscribe. Because what that dog remembered next would bring an entire unit down to its knees. 6 hours before the containment wing erupted, Caleb Ward reached Fort Bragg's retired K9 annex in a pickup that coughed smoke through the gate lane. The guards noticed the cracked windshield before they noticed him. He wore the same faded medic jacket he had kept after Kandahar, washed thin at the elbows, with a rusted dog tag sewn inside the inner pocket. To the base. He was no longer Staff Sergeant Ward, combat medic. He was a discharged man with damaged nerves, overdue bills, and a file note that made every official look at him with practiced caution. The notice had arrived in a county mailbox, folded between a power bill and a warning from his landlord. Rex, the paper said, would be transferred to permanent containment by sundown after repeated rehabilitation failures. Caleb had read the sentence so many times the words lost shape. Rex was not the name his brother had used. Daniel Ward had called the dog Atlas. And Atlas had slept under Daniel's cot, ridden beside him in dust-choked convoys, and once refused food for a day because Daniel had been flown out wounded without him. At the reception desk, Caleb handed over the appeal packet he had prepared on cheap printer paper. The clerk scanned the denial stamp and slid it back as if returning a bad check. The retired K9 had bitten 2 handlers, broken 1 kennel gate, and failed 3 evaluations. Civilian contact was prohibited. Former personnel had no standing. Caleb listened without arguing, because anger had cost him credibility once. And Voss's report had made sure every raised voice from him sounded like proof of instability instead of proof of pain. That report had followed him for 6 years. It said the medic was disoriented after the Kandahar blast, that he misremembered radio traffic, that his claim about a changed route could not be verified. It did not say Daniel had shoved a dog tag into Caleb's bloody palm before his breathing failed. It did not say Atlas had stood over Daniel's body while flares burned the valley white. It did not say Caleb had heard Voss on the radio, calm and close, pushing the squad toward a road Daniel had warned against. When Caleb asked to see Rex with his own eyes, the young officer's expression hardened. The dog was not family, not a veteran, not a witness to anything the Army recognized. It was government property with a dangerous classification. Caleb's hand moved to the dog tag beneath his jacket, but he kept it hidden. Voss and Blue Hawk had searched for missing evidence after Kandahar, yet they had never found this piece, because Daniel had trusted a medic, not a commander. with the last thing he could protect. Through the glass beyond the desk, Caleb saw the training yard and felt the past step closer. Two handlers lifted a black combat harness from a storage case. Its chest plate was scarred in the same place Daniel's had been, and its buckle carried the same dull scrape where a tag once clicked before patrol. Behind the far fence, Rex appeared in a basket muzzle, body frozen. He ignored the men until one of them raised the harness. Then his ears twitched, his nose lifted, and his entire frame tightened with recognition. Caleb understood immediately. A man in a Blue Hawk jacket signed the transfer log nearby, smiling as if he were collecting damaged equipment. Caleb recognized the Blue Hawk logo from supply crates unloaded outside Kandahar before the ambush. Crates that never appeared in the official inventory. The patterns settled cold inside him. They did not know where Daniel's evidence was, but they knew Atlas remembered something. So they had renamed him, provoked him, and let every reaction become another nail in his file. Caleb stepped away from the desk before fear could stop him. He had not come to win an argument. He had come to reach a dog before the system buried him alive. Somewhere behind that fence, Atlas was still waiting for the right sound, the right scent, and the one name Caleb had not dared speak since the night his brother died under Kandahar's choking smoke. Caleb was not allowed into the yard. He was taken instead into an evaluation room that looked less like a place for healing than a place for closing cases. White light flattened everything. Steel chairs waited along one wall. Cameras watched from the ceiling. On the table sat a thick folder marked Rex, though Caleb's hand tightened inside his jacket every time he saw that false name. Behind reinforced glass, the black German shepherd stood in a basket muzzle, still as a weapon left loaded by mistake. The veterinary officer began the review without emotion. The file named 3 failed rehabilitation attempts, 2 handler bites, 1 broken kennel gate, repeated fixation on chest equipment, and violent resistance to standard control methods. Severe aggression, handler reactive, civilian contact prohibited, permanent containment recommended. The words made the room feel clean and final, as if a living creature could be folded into paper, stamped dangerous, and forgotten before lunch. Caleb watched every officer accept the summary with the relief of people who preferred documents to difficult truth. On the first screen, Rex stood calm until a handler approached with black gloves bearing the Blue Hawk mark. The man did not offer food, space, or a neutral command. He reached straight for the old harness, fingers pressing near the scarred chest buckle. Rex struck before the buckle opened. On the second screen, another handler repeated the movement, this time dragging the harness across the concrete first, letting its smell flood the kennel. Rex lunged again. On the third, the camera caught the handler glancing sideways before touching the same ring, as if waiting for the dog to perform the violence required by the report. Caleb saw the pattern before anyone named it. The tests were not measuring recovery. They were building a record. Each failure began with the same ingredients: Blue Hawk gloves, burned leather, the harness copied from Daniel's last patrol, and a hand reaching for the place Atlas had defended in the crater. Voss did not need to know where Daniel's evidence had gone. He only needed Atlas locked away from anyone who might understand the dog's memory. A monster could be sedated. A liability could be sealed. A grieving soldier with a nose for guilt was harder to control. The folder skipped the years before Kandahar, and that absence made Caleb angrier than the accusations. There was no full citation for the bridge where Atlas found a pressure plate under loose gravel, saving a convoy before dawn. There was no photograph of Daniel kneeling beside him after the flood search, both soaked to the bone, the missing boy wrapped in a blanket behind them. There was no note about the Marine Atlas dragged from a burning doorway while rounds snapped through the smoke. The file kept the bites and erased the lives saved, because gratitude would have weakened the case for burying him. Behind the glass, Rex kept his eyes on the harness. The muzzle hid his mouth, but not his body. His shoulders lifted whenever the leather swung. His paws spread against the floor. His breath fogged the pain in short bursts. Caleb knew that posture from battlefield medicine. It was not random rage. It was a patient guarding a wound nobody had cleaned. Every time they forced the harness close, Atlas was dragged back beneath red flares, back to Daniel bleeding in the dust. Back to the order Caleb had failed to understand until too late. Major Voss entered before Caleb could challenge the footage. His uniform carried authority the room still trusted, and his calm did more damage than anger would have. He reviewed the file as if the conclusion had written itself. The contractor in the Blue Hawk jacket waited near the door, pretending impatience while watching the dog with the tense interest of a man, hoping a dangerous animal would remain dangerous. Caleb noticed the contractor's gloves tucked into his pocket. Dark leather stained with the same chemical solvent used on the harness. The next clip showed why the containment order had been rushed. A handler had entered the kennel at night, outside regular evaluation hours, wearing those gloves and carrying Daniel's style of harness. Rex had not attacked until the man reached beneath the chest strap, searching with 2 fingers instead of handling a buckle. The official caption called it unprovoked aggression. Caleb saw a search interrupted. Someone had been probing the dog for a clue, trying to discover what Daniel had hidden and who might have carried it away. Then the tray rolled closer, carrying the syringe that would quiet Atlas forever. Tasers lifted. The inner gate unlocked. Caleb felt the dog tag against his chest and understood the room had stopped judging a dog. It was preparing to erase the last survivor who still remembered Kandahar clearly. If he stayed behind the line, Atlas would vanish under the lie, by sundown, forever. This was the moment the morning had been driving toward. The same yellow line, the same raised tasers, the same rusted tag hidden in Caleb Ward's fist. Only now the room had context. Everyone had seen the videos, the staged triggers, the Blue Hawk gloves, the old harness lifted like bait before a wounded animal. Rex was straining against the chain behind the open gate. But Caleb no longer saw Rex. He saw Atlas, the dog Daniel had trusted in dust, gunfire, and moonless patrols. The one survivor still being punished for remembering too much. The handler moved the harness closer, and Atlas changed instantly. His shoulders rose. His paws carved white lines into the concrete, and his breath hammered against the muzzle basket. The room broke into motion. A guard widened his stance. The veterinarian steadied the syringe. Major Voss lifted one hand, not high enough to look afraid, but high enough to give permission when the dog crossed the distance. Caleb stepped past the warnings and lowered himself with the care of a medic approaching a blast victim. Slow enough to be seen, brave enough to be mistaken for madness. He did not shout a command. He did not reach for the leash or raise his arms like the handlers who had failed him. He took the dog tag from inside his jacket and unfolded the cloth Daniel had bled through years before. The hinge resisted at first, stiff with rust and desert grit, then opened with a dry click so small it should have disappeared beneath alarms. Instead, the sound reached Atlas like a field signal. The chain snapped tight, but the dog stopped before the metal could drag him back. Caleb set the open tag on the floor. Inside lay a half-burned photograph of Daniel kneeling beside a younger Atlas, both of them caught in a rare second of sunlight before the war took its price. Beneath the photo was a square of medic cloth, stained brown at the edge. still carrying the faint bite of antiseptic. Smoke. And Caleb's hands. He let the dog smell it before he spoke, the name buried under 6 years of reports. Atlas. Not loud. Not desperate. Just true. The growl broke off as if someone had cut the wire holding it. Atlas lifted his ears and blinked once. Slowly. Painfully. Like waking from a nightmare inside another nightmare. His eyes left the harness and found Caleb's face. His nose worked over the air. Sorting burned brass. Old blood. Field antiseptic. Blue Hawk solvent. Fear. And the one living scent that belonged to the crater. His weight shifted forward. But the violence had changed shape. He was not charging now. He was searching. The taser lights trembled across his ribs and slid away when the guard lowered his aim. No order had done that. No rank had earned it. The dog everyone feared took one careful step. Then another. Until the chain lay slack behind him like something shed from an old life. He lowered his head to the tag, breathed in, and made a sound too soft for the room that had been prepared to kill him. Caleb opened his palm. Atlas pressed his scarred muzzle into it. For a few seconds, nothing in the annex moved. The cameras watched. The syringe waited. Voss stared at the tag with a stillness that finally betrayed him. Because he recognized Daniel's field, marks scratched beneath the photograph. He had known evidence had survived somewhere. But not where Daniel had hidden it, or which broken survivor had carried it out of Kandahar. Atlas nudged the dog tag with his nose. Not toward Voss. Not toward the officers. But back to Caleb. Pressing the hinge again with deliberate care, Caleb understood then that Daniel had trusted 2 guardians. One had hands and a pulse. The other had teeth. Memory and a loyalty no report could rewrite. He slid his thumbnail beneath the second seam in the tag. The hidden plate resisted, then lifted with a brittle pop. A microchip no larger than a fingernail dropped onto the cloth. Voss stepped forward too fast. Atlas rose between them without a bark. Without a wasted snarl. Guarding the chip with the calm certainty of a soldier whose mission had finally reached daylight. The truth did not need a speech yet. It only needed the sight of Caleb closing his hand around the chip while Atlas stood beside him. Unmuzzled in spirit, even with leather still strapped across his jaws. The men who had prepared to erase him looked at the harness, the tag, the contractor gloves, and the fear draining from Voss's face. For the first time since Kandahar, the dog was not alone with what he remembered. Caleb rested a hand on his head gently. The microchip lay in Caleb's palm, smaller than the crescent of his thumbnail, yet heavy enough to change the air in the evaluation room. Atlas stood beside his knee with the muzzle still strapped across his scarred jaws. But no one looked at the leather anymore. They looked at the chip, the open dog tag, and Major Voss, whose hand had moved toward the evidence before any innocent man would have known what it was. That single movement did more damage than a confession. It told the room Voss had not been surprised by the possibility of proof, only by where it had been hiding. The veterinary officer recovered first. She removed a secure reader from the evidence cabinet and placed it on the table with both hands, as if rough movement might frighten the truth back into silence. Caleb set the chip into the tray. The screen flickered, went black, then opened on a folder marked with Daniel Ward's service number. No dramatic music filled the room. There was only the low hum of fluorescent lights. Atlas breathing through the muzzle, and the clicking keys of a technician suddenly aware that every second was being recorded. The first files were maps. The official report showed Daniel's patrol choosing the eastern road after a radio failure. A clean explanation for a dirty graveyard. Daniel's hidden route log showed the opposite. His team had been assigned the western road, already cleared by engineers that afternoon. 47 minutes before departure. The route had been changed through Voss's authorization terminal. The new path ran through a dry wash marked high risk for buried pressure plates. Daniel had flagged it twice. His warnings had been deleted from the public packet. But the chip kept them intact. Time-stamped. Numbered. Impossible to soften. The next file opened a contractor manifest. Blue Hawk Security had built an emergency stabilization package 2 days before the ambush was supposed to exist. Fuel, armored transport, communications gear, and private recovery personnel had all been approved in advance under Voss's signature. The Blue Hawk logo on the invoice matched the gloves, the storage crates, and the jacket of the contractor now standing near the door with his face drained of color. Caleb felt no triumph. He felt the cold arithmetic of betrayal. Daniel's squad had not wandered into danger. They had been steered there to create a contract. The room changed one person at a time. A guard lowered his taser until the red dot slid off Atlas's ribs. The veterinary officer stepped to the syringe tray and locked the sedative away. The young officer who had called Caleb former personnel stared at the screen as if the words there had stripped rank from everyone. Voss tried to stand still, but the muscles in his jaw worked beneath his skin. He had spent 6 years depending on distance from Kandahar, distance from Daniel's body, distance from a medic nobody believed, distance from a dog renamed until memory looked like madness. Caleb saw the behavior files differently now, and so did the room. Each failed rehabilitation had placed Atlas near the same scent family: Blue Hawk solvent, scorched leather, black gloves, the copied harness, hands probing the chest strap as if searching for a hidden compartment that was never there. Voss had not known Caleb carried the dog tag. That ignorance had saved the evidence. What he had known was that Daniel had hidden something before he died, that Atlas had guarded Daniel's body, and that Caleb had walked away from the crater with blood closed around his fist. The older videos began to make sense in reverse. Atlas had not bitten the first handler because of a command failure. The man had pressed Blue Hawk leather beneath the dog's nose. He had not shattered the kennel gate out of blind rage. A contractor had entered after hours and lifted Daniel's style of harness from a sealed case. He had not refused adoption because he hated people. He had flinched from anyone carrying the chemical stink of the men who turned a patrol into bait. His body had been reading evidence long after the humans stopped reading him. The technician opened the final audio file. Static filled the speakers. Then Daniel's voice came through, broken by wind and rotor wash, reporting the changed coordinates and requesting confirmation. Another voice answered with command authority, smooth and close enough to freeze Caleb's hands on Atlas's collar. It was Voss, ordering the patrol forward. Daniel's last transmission followed minutes later. Not panic, not confusion, but a clipped warning that the route had been compromised. The official transcript had replaced it with radio interference. The chip kept the truth in Daniel's own voice. Rough, urgent, and alive for a moment. Voss reached for procedure because power had always hidden there. He moved toward the reader, intending to classify the material before anyone outside the annex saw it. Atlas stepped between him and the table. The movement was quiet, precise, and devastating. He did not attack. He only placed his body where Daniel's evidence lay, the same way he had placed it over Daniel in the dust. The guards understood before Voss did. They blocked him from the table, secured his sidearm, and called military police. The Blue Hawk contractor tried to leave, but the manifest on the screen had already closed every door. By the time the first investigators arrived, the containment order had lost its power. The muzzle came off Atlas without a struggle. Caleb kept one hand on the dog's neck while officers copied the files, photographed the tag, and sealed the harness in an evidence bag. No one called him Rex. No one called Caleb unstable. The annex that had been built to silence a dangerous animal now stood around a medic, a K-9, and a dead soldier's proof. Atlas leaned into Caleb's leg, exhausted but steady. While daylight widened beyond the glass and the buried road out of Kandahar finally opened, 3 weeks after the annex doors opened, Caleb Ward returned to Fort Bragg without guards at his elbows. The evaluation room had been turned into an evidence chamber, and the same steel table that once held a syringe now held route maps, copied invoices, sealed gloves, and the rusted dog tag in a pouch. Caleb wore the faded medic jacket because he wanted no one to mistake him for a man cleaned up for sympathy. Atlas lay beside his chair, unmuzzled, his new leather collar resting loose against the scar tissue where a chain had rubbed him raw for years. The inquiry moved slowly, which made it feel real. Investigators verified Daniel Ward's hidden route log against satellite records, radio timestamps, and Blue Hawk's own billing trail. The ambush had not been a tragedy caused by confusion. It had been arranged before Daniel ever stepped into the convoy. Major Harlan Voss had authorized the route change, approved the emergency contract, and then buried every warning that pointed back to him. When military police escorted him from the room, no one saluted. Rank fell away from him like paint from rotten wood, and the silence he left behind felt cleaner inside. Blue Hawk collapsed differently. Contractors who had laughed at Caleb's appeal began giving statements before lunch, each man trying to place the blame higher than himself. Storage lockers were opened. Training videos were seized. The black gloves, the copied harness, the solvent bottles, and the after-hours access logs formed a second confession without a human voice. The two handlers who had provoked Atlas lost their credentials that same day. By evening, the company's base contracts were frozen, and the transfer truck meant to carry Rex away sat behind crime scene tape, empty and useless under the rain near the gate. Caleb's hearing came after the arrests, in a smaller room with fewer cameras and more weight. For 6 years, his file had called him unstable in every polite way possible. Now, the review board read his original statement beside Daniel's files, and the old dismissal could not survive the evidence. His testimony was restored. His discharge notes were amended. The word unreliable was removed from the record. Caleb did not smile when it happened. He lowered his head, pressed his thumb against the edge of the dog tag pouch, and breathed like someone finally allowed to put down a pack. Daniel's family received the truth in the base chapel. His mother sat in the front row, with Atlas at her feet, one hand buried in the shepherd's thick neck fur, as if touching him connected her to the son she had lost. The corrected report described Daniel's warning, his refusal to ignore the altered route, and the evidence he hid before the patrol moved out. His name was no longer tied to careless judgment. It was tied to courage. When Atlas leaned his head against her knee, the woman who had feared war dogs kissed the scar between his ears. Atlas's own record was corrected last. The board read the old labels one final time. Not to condemn him, but to expose how language had been used as a cage. Failed asset became decorated military working dog. Severe aggression became trauma response to staged triggers. Rex disappeared from the active record, and Atlas Ward returned in black ink. The veterinarian who had once prepared the final syringe unclipped the evidence collar and replaced it with soft brown leather. Atlas sniffed it, then looked at Caleb, waiting for permission instead of command. And Caleb gave it there with one quiet nod. The cemetery waited under a gray American sky. Caleb drove there before taking Atlas home, because some missions deserved a proper ending. Rain dotted the rows of white stones and darkened the sleeves of his jacket. At Daniel's grave, Caleb opened the pouch and set the clean dog tag against the marble. Atlas stepped forward, sniffed the metal, then nudged it until it rested directly below Daniel's name. There was no command in the movement, only completion. The dog lowered himself beside the stone, chest in the wet grass, eyes soft. Post finally relieved after years of guard duty alone. Caleb cried there, but not loudly. He cried the way soldiers often do, with one hand over his mouth and his shoulders barely moving, because the body remembers how to stay quiet near the dead. Atlas did not lick the tears away like a pet in a movie. He simply stayed, warm and solid beside him, until Caleb could breathe without pain sharpening every inhale. Then they walked back through the rain together. No leash pulled tight, no muzzle between them. Only a man, a dog, and the brother they had carried home at last. Back from the war together. Home was smaller than the annex and kinder than any ceremony. Caleb's porch sagged. The heater complained. And Atlas chose the worn rug beside his bed as if it were a medal. Daniel's photograph stood on the mantel. The empty tag, open beneath it. Near midnight, Caleb woke to a muzzle against his hand, whispered Atlas's true name, and felt the old K9 sleep without fear. Thank you for staying with their story. If Atlas touched your heart, come on, share it with another dog lover. And subscribe so the next loyal K9 can find justice too when the time comes.